I have covered Stalingrad many times on my History at War channel. The encirclement, the street fighting, the 62nd Army pressed back to a strip of rubble on the Volga, the German 6th Army walking into the pocket that closed around them in November 1942. But what if I told you that there was a Stalingrad before Stalingrad? What if I told you that in a fortress city on the San River in what is now southeastern Poland, between the autumn of 1914 and the spring of 1915, something happened that bears comparison with Stalingrad in almost every specific that matters? A city encircled, a garrison trapped and starving, relief offensives launched and broken against Russian defensive lines, a command that lied to its own men about whether help was coming, a surrender of over 100,000 soldiers, and a human cost, counting both the garrison and the relief forces that died trying to reach it, that exceeded the combined casualties of Verdun and the Somme. The city was called Przemysl. Most people in the English-speaking world cannot pronounce it and have never heard of it. The Cambridge historian Alexander Watson, who wrote the most comprehensive English-language account of the siege, called it the Stalingrad of the First World War. He was right, and almost nobody knows it happened. Przemysl sat on the San River in Galicia, the northeastern province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the territory that is now southeastern Poland, close to the Ukrainian border. It was, in the years before the war, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The Austrian military had been building its defences since the 1870s, expanding and modernising them through the following decades, as the possibility of war with Russia moved from theoretical to likely. By 1914, the fortress consisted of a ring of 35 major forts in a circumference of approximately 30 miles, with 18 subsidiary forts and 12 major artillery emplacements. The ring enclosed not just the fortress works but the city itself, a community of 46,000 people, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Austrians, the third largest city in Galicia, after Krakow and Lemberg. The city's residents spoke their prayers in Polish, Ukrainian, Yiddish, German, and a dozen other languages. The garrison orders of the day, when the siege came, were issued in 15 languages to cover every man who might need to read them. The fortress had been personally overseen in its later stages of development by Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination at Sarajevo in June 1914 had started the war. The irony is precise. The man whose murder produced the conflict had spent years building the structure that would become the site of one of the war's most catastrophic sieges, a fortress that absorbed the lives of hundreds of thousands of men on both sides and ultimately fell anyway. General Hermann Kuzmanek von Bergneustatten received the message that he was on his own on September 16, 1914, his 60th birthday. The Austrian field army had been retreating westward past Przemysl for days, streaming south toward the Carpathian mountains after the catastrophic defeat of the Galician campaign, in which Austria-Hungary had suffered approximately 400,000 casualties in 6 weeks and lost 60% of its pre-war professional officer corps. The Russian armies under General Nikolai Ivanov had overwhelmed the Austrian positions in the initial fighting and were now advancing into Galicia, sweeping past the fortress and around it. One message reached Kuzmanek by aircraft: hold at all costs. He pressed on with the preparation for siege that he had known, for weeks, was coming. The garrison when the siege began was approximately 130,000 men. This figure requires immediate qualification because it was supposed to be 50,000. The fortress had been planned and provisioned for a garrison of 85,000, and even that had been considered generous. What had happened was that in the chaos of the Austrian retreat, entire formations that had lost their logistical trains and could not march had taken refuge inside the fortress walls rather than be left behind. An army corps that should have retreated with the field forces was still in Przemysl when the Russian encirclement closed. The city was filled with men that the supply calculations had not accounted for, eating through provisions at a rate the planners had never imagined. The provisions specifically calculated to sustain a garrison for approximately 80 days would now have to feed 130,000 men. The arithmetic of this miscalculation runs through everything that follows. Inside the fortress, alongside the soldiers, were 21,000 horses, potential food if the rations ran out, and approximately 30,000 civilians who had not evacuated when ordered. Children were attending schools that would reopen in January 1915 because normal life, or some simulacrum of it, had to be maintained for psychological reasons. The cinema, the Olympia, was showing films, The theatres were staging comedy because the commanders understood that laughter had a military value. People queued for bread at prices that Helena Jablonska, a middle-aged Polish woman of some means who was renting rooms to garrison officers and whose diary has survived, described as extortionate. She wrote in October 1914, "The soldiers are out on the streets begging. Municipal authorities try to regulate the prices, but then all the goods vanish." This was October. The worst was still months away. On September 17, 1914, the first Russian shot of the siege was fired from Fort/5 Popovich toward a Russian cavalry patrol near the village of Tiskovice. By September 26th, the encirclement was complete. The Russians had cut every road out of the city. 131,000 people and 21,000 horses were trapped inside a ring of Russian divisions. General Radko Dmitriev, commanding the Russian Third Army, which had been assigned to reduce the fortress, did not have adequate siege artillery. The correct response to this problem, by any standard of military logic, was to wait until the heavy guns arrived. Dmitriev instead ordered a frontal assault. He had 6 divisions available. He threw them at the fortress perimeter beginning on September 24th, and for 3 days the assault waves went forward against prepared positions, defended by men who had been building those positions for weeks. On the morning of October 4th, a Russian officer appeared under a flag of truce at Fort 11 and delivered a formal demand for the fortress to surrender. The message was driven blindfolded to Kusmanek's headquarters. Kusmanek refused without deliberation. On October 5th, the bombardment intensified. On October 6th, the infantry was within 500 meters of the fort walls, and at 3 o'clock in the morning of October 7th, something disturbed the sentries at Fort Y/1 on the southeastern perimeter. The account of what happened at Fort Y/1 that night survives in enough detail to reconstruct what those specific hours felt like from the inside. A soldier in one of the advanced listening posts positioned forward of the main fort walls in the darkness fired a warning shot. According to one version of events, he fired the warning shot, and then the advancing Russians reached his position and cut his throat before he could fire again. Inside the fort, the warning shot was enough. The fort commander, a man named Bielek, rushed to the wall and ordered flares to be fired. The flickering light revealed what no one in the fort had expected. The leading edge of the Russian assault wave was already at the bottom of the fort's glacis. The Russians had covered the distance from their start positions to the base of the Austrian fortifications in darkness without being detected. The Russians turned on large searchlights simultaneously. The lights illuminated the fort and blinded the defenders, who were trying to sight their weapons. Then the Russian artillery opened on Fort 1/1 with everything it had. The garrison, half blinded by the searchlights, half deafened by the artillery, held their nerve and began firing into the mass of men below them. By 5 in the morning, approximately 2,000 men of the Russian Crimean Infantry Regiment No. 73 were close enough to the fort wall that the Ukrainians in the garrison could hear their conversation between bursts of gunfire. The Russians had come so far, so fast, that the distance had collapsed from the hundreds of meters that fortress doctrine required to something closer to shouting distance. The Russians threw a portable bridge over the defensive ditch that fronted the fort wall. With the bridge in place and men pouring across it, the situation inside the fort became critical. Then an ensign named Hans Seiler made a decision that the official account describes with the careful neutrality of a report that knows it was describing a man acting without orders because the man with orders to give was not acting. Seiler went to one of the turret guns and fired it himself. He had not been ordered to. The timing was precise. The canister round from the turret gun caught the Crimean regiment men crossing the bridge and climbing the fort wall at the moment when they were most densely packed and most exposed. The effect was what canister does to men in dense formation at close range. The assault on Fort 1/1 collapsed. For the next 2 days, the fighting around the fortress perimeter was continuous, and the Russians tried different sectors, attacking forts XA, XIA, XI, and XII on the northern sector. They could not reach the wire in front of those forts. On October 9th, a cavalry unit from the Austrian Field Relief Force reached Przemysl, and on October 11th the siege was lifted. The Russian assault in 3 days had cost 40,000 casualties. The fortress had held. The whole Austro-Hungarian Empire heard about it. The story of how Przemysl had held against the Russian onslaught, how a besieged garrison had repelled an assault that had cost the attackers 40,000 men in 3 days, was exactly the kind of news the Empire needed in a campaign that had otherwise been almost uninterrupted catastrophe. Kusmanek was celebrated. The garrison were heroes. The New York Times ran a story about a pigeon post message received in Vienna. "We are doing very well," says message to Vienna. On November 29, 1914, that headline appeared in newspapers in New York. The victory was real, the relief was genuine, and it lasted approximately 1 month. The German offensive against Warsaw that had forced the Russians to lift the first siege failed in November, and the Austro-Hungarian field army that had briefly reached Przemysl was forced back again. On November 9th, 1914, the Russian 11th Army under General Andrei Selivanov arrived before Przemysl, and the second siege began. Selivanov had watched what had happened to the Russian Third Army's assault troops in October and had drawn the obvious conclusion. There would be no more frontal assaults, no more waves of infantry against prepared positions in the dark. General Famine would conduct the second siege of Przemysl. The garrison that Selivanov was now starving was in a different condition from the garrison that had repelled the October assault. In the month of the relief, the Austrian field army had drawn heavily on the fortress's supply magazines to replenish its own depleted stocks. The provisions that had been calculated to sustain the garrison for 80 days had already been significantly reduced. The 130,000 men now trapped inside the fortress walls were facing a siege that would stretch to 133 days on provisions that had originally been calculated for 80. The mathematics of catastrophe were already in motion. The orders of the day were issued in 15 languages. The diversity of the garrison was one of the specific qualities of Przemysl that made it unlike anything in any other war of the period. Austrians, Hungarians, Romanians, Serbs, Slovaks, Czechs, Italians, Poles, and Ruthenians, all defending the same walls, all eating the same diminishing rations, all sleeping in the same dugouts, all sick and cold and increasingly desperate together. The ethnic tensions that the Empire's political structures had kept in imperfect equilibrium in peacetime began to surface under siege conditions. Rumours circulated that Ruthenians, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, who were considered Russophile by the Austrian military establishment, were signalling to the Russian besiegers. Men were arrested on the basis of no evidence. The atmosphere of mutual suspicion that prolonged confinement, fear, and starvation produces added its own specific misery to the physical conditions. From December 1914, Russian aircraft began dropping bombs on Przemysl. These were among the earliest aerial bombing raids in the history of warfare. The bombs were largely ineffective in a military sense. The aircraft of 1914 were primitive delivery systems and the bombs were small, but the psychological effect of knowing that the sky itself was no longer a safe dimension was real and cumulative. The garrison had been trained for the specific challenges of fortress warfare. Artillery, infantry assault, tunnelling operations. Nobody had prepared them for bombs from the air. The doctor named Joseph Thoman, who had been recruited into military service as a junior medical officer and who kept a diary that has survived, recorded what December and January looked like from inside the fortress hospital. His account of the hospitals is one of the specific documents of the siege that has been quoted most often, and for reasons that are uncomfortable, because what it describes, alongside the genuine medical crisis of a garrison consuming itself through malnutrition, is the behaviour of officers who had access to resources that their men did not. He wrote, "The hospitals have been recruiting teenage girls as nurses. They get 120 crowns a month and free meals. Their main job is to satisfy the lust of the gentlemen officers and, rather shamefully, of a number of doctors too. New officers are coming in almost daily, with cases of syphilis, gonorrhea, and soft chancre. The poor girls feel so flattered when they get chatted up by one of these pestilent pigs in their spotless uniforms, with their shiny boots and buttons." Thoman was writing in January 1915. The irony of spotless uniforms and shiny boots in a city that was beginning to starve is not lost in his account. It is the specific irony of a military hierarchy that preserved its privileges while the men under it were beginning to eat tree bark. Elena Jablonska continued her diary through the winter. Her accounts shift in register as the conditions worsen. In October, she wrote about price gouging and the inconvenience of having soldiers billeted in her rooms. By January, she was writing about the specific colour of people's skin. the yellowing, the hollowing, the specific look that malnutrition produces in a human face. She wrote, "Starvation is kicking in. Sunken, pale figures wander like corpses through the streets, their stony faces a picture of utter despair." She was describing the civilian population of a city that was still technically at war, still garrisoned by 130,000 armed soldiers, still receiving the occasional supply run by aircraft, still nominally in the custody of an empire that had once been one of the most powerful in Europe, and the people in the streets looked like corpses walking. By late December, the slaughter of horses had begun. The 21,000 horses that had been inside the fortress when the siege started were the garrison's food reserve of last resort, the protein source that stood between the soldiers and starvation once the conventional supplies ran out. By December, the conventional supplies were running out, and the horses were dying anyway. They too were starving. And so the calculation shifted from feeding the horses to feeding the men with the horses. A joke began to circulate among the garrison. What was the difference between the soldiers of Troy and the soldiers of Przemysl? In Troy, the soldiers were in the horse's belly. In Przemysl, the horse was in the soldiers' bellies. The joke required a certain specific kind of gallows humour to find funny, the kind that men develop when the alternative to laughing is something they cannot afford to do. The bread, by January and February, was being adulterated, flour mixed with bone meal, with wood shavings, with sawdust, with the bark that men had stripped from the trees inside the fortress perimeter. The loaves that resulted could technically be called bread in that they were baked. In every other respect, they were something different. Men ate them because there was nothing else to eat. Now I want to bring you to the specific human being whose story I think captures Przemysl in the way that no statistic or military analysis can. His name was Geza Gioni, and he was a Hungarian poet, and he was 30 years old when the siege began, and he was inside Przemysl because he had been mobilized into the Austro-Hungarian army and assigned to a unit that was garrisoning the fortress. Gioni had been born Geza Akim on June 25, 1884 in the small village of Gion, near Dabas in Hungary, the son of a Lutheran pastor. He had studied in a seminary, left after injuring himself in a bizarre incident involving Russian roulette with a rival journalist, a detail that suggests something about the specific quality of risk he was comfortable taking, and had become a newspaper correspondent and then a poet, adopting the name of his birthplace as his pen name. Before the war, he had written a famous pacifist poem, Caesar, Why Will Not Go, which expressed his conviction that the Austro-Hungarian military establishment was preparing a war that would serve no one. When the war actually started, he found himself, like many pacifists who had opposed wars in the abstract, caught up in the specific reality of a conflict that had already started, and that required him to participate regardless of what he believed about it. He was mobilized. He reported for duty. He went to Galicia. During the siege, Gioni wrote. He wrote poems inside the fortress, and they were published inside the fortress in a collection called By Campfire on the Fields of Poland, and a copy of the collection was sent out of the encircled city by aeroplane, an extraordinary logistical feat in 1914, and reached Budapest, where it was received with considerable acclaim. The politician Jenő Rákóczi used the poetry as nationalist propaganda without Gioni's permission, presenting the poet as a brave soldier poet embodying Hungarian military virtue against the pacifist Endre Ady. Gioni, who knew exactly what was happening to his work and could do nothing about it, responded by writing poems that became darker and more bitter as the siege continued. His poem, Just for One Single Night, was written during the worst days of the siege. It addressed itself to the armchair patriots and war profiteers who were celebrating the defence of Przemysl from the safety of Budapest while the men inside were eating bark bread and drinking snowmelt. Send them away just for one night, he wrote, who love their country with long babbling tongues. He meant, send them here, let them be here, let them eat what we eat and sleep where we sleep and see what we see. Then they can talk about love of country. He was writing what Wilfred Owen was writing at the same time, from the same specific experience of the gap between the way war was described by people who were not in it and the way it was experienced by people who were. Nobody in the English-speaking world has heard of Geza Gioni. His poems are in Hungarian. He is to Hungary what Owen is to Britain. The parallel is almost exact. By March 1st, 1915, the distribution of food to civilians had stopped entirely. The garrison was eating what remained and the civilians were not. By March 1st, 15,000 men, 1 in 8 of the garrison, were hospitalized due to malnutrition and disease. Rats and mice had disappeared from the streets. They had been eaten. The bark was gone from every tree inside the perimeter that could be reached. Now, Conrad von Hötzendorf, because the siege of Przemysl cannot be properly understood without understanding the man who was responsible for the relief offensives that failed to reach it, and Conrad is one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire First World War. Not because of his military achievement, which was catastrophic, but because of the specific combination of personal obsession and professional incompetence that made him simultaneously the most ambitious and most destructive senior commander on the Eastern Front. Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf was the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff. He was 62 years old in 1914. He had been proposing preventive wars against Serbia, Italy and Russia for years before the actual war started, with a frequency that had exhausted his subordinates and irritated his emperor. He believed in the offensive with a purity of conviction that was not moderated by any significant consideration of whether the offensive was achievable given the resources available. He was also, for the 6 years immediately preceding the war, conducting an obsessive courtship of a married woman named Gina von Reininghaus, whom he had met in 1907 and with whom he had fallen in love with a completeness that shaped his entire professional life during the war years. Conrad proposed marriage to Gina von Reininghaus 7 times between 1907 and 1915. She was the wife of a Viennese industrialist and she could not, initially, obtain a divorce. Conrad wrote her hundreds of letters during these years, including during the war itself, in which he described his military campaigns in terms that were explicitly linked to his desire to impress her, to prove himself worthy of her, to demonstrate through battlefield achievement the qualities that would make him a man she should choose. He genuinely believed that military glory would help him win her. His biographers have established beyond reasonable doubt that Conrad's aggressive operational planning during the war was partly driven by this personal motivation, that the man commanding the Austro-Hungarian armies was making strategic decisions about when and where and how to attack, partly because he was trying to impress a woman in Vienna. Gina eventually obtained her divorce in 1915 after Przemysl had fallen. She married Conrad. He had proven himself. The cost of the proof was somewhere north of 1 million casualties in the Carpathian offensives alone. I find Conrad useful as a human document of the war precisely because he is not a monster in the conventional sense. He was not indifferent to the men under his command, in the way that the word indifferent suggests. He was something more complicated, a man whose professional vanity and personal obsession had grown so large that they had crowded out the capacity to genuinely calculate what the lives of 670,000 men in the Carpathians were worth against the possibility of relieving Przemysl. He could plan and he could order, and he could calculate on maps, and he was entirely unable to connect those calculations to the specific physical reality of what the men carrying them out were experiencing. This gap between the staff officer's map and the soldier's experience is not unique to Conrad. It is the defining moral failure of the First World War at the senior command level on every front. Conrad's version of it was simply more extreme and more expensive than most. The 3 Carpathian relief offensives that Conrad launched between January and March 1915 were each conceived as decisive operations that would break through the Russian lines, reach the besieged fortress and relieve Kuzminek's garrison. Each was launched with formations that were inadequately clothed, inadequately fed, inadequately equipped for winter mountain warfare, and trained by officers who had been promoted to replace the 60% of the professional officer corps that had been killed or captured in the Galician campaign. The men who climbed into the Carpathian passes in January 1915 were, in many cases, recruits who had been in the army for weeks rather than years, led by reserve officers who had been teachers or civil servants in peacetime, carrying weapons that jammed in the cold, wearing boots with cardboard soles because the Empire's leather supply was exhausted. Colonel Georg Wyth of the Third Army wrote in his diary on March 1st, 1915, during the Second Offensive, "Fog and heavy snowfalls. We have lost all sense of direction. Entire regiments are getting lost, resulting in catastrophic losses." He was writing about entire regiments, formations of 2,000 to 3,000 men, becoming so disoriented in the Carpathian snowstorms that they ceased to function as military units, blundering through snow that was chest deep in the passes, unable to navigate by sight because the visibility was zero, unable to navigate by map because the maps were inadequate for the terrain. Men fell into ravines. Men sat down in the snow and did not get up again. Men with wounds froze to death in the hours before they could be evacuated because the evacuation routes through the mountain passes were too narrow and too exposed for stretcher parties to move safely. Archduke Joseph August, commanding 7th Corps in the First Offensive, sent Conrad a report in February 1915 that contained a sentence I find genuinely haunting every time I read it. He reported that his Hungarian Honved division had suffered terrible losses, and that its effective fighting strength had fallen to fewer than 2,000 men. And then he wrote, "And tomorrow, despite the casualties, we have to attack again." The specific quality of exhaustion and resignation in that sentence, "and tomorrow, despite the casualties," is the sound of a man who has been ordered to do something that he knows is impossible and who is going to do it anyway because the order has been given, and who has been doing it long enough that the phrase "despite the casualties" no longer carries the weight it should, because the casualties have become the context rather than the exception. The wounded in the Carpathians froze to death. This needs to be stated plainly. Men who had been shot or had limbs shattered by artillery could not move in the deep snow, and in the temperatures of the Carpathian passes in winter, which dropped regularly below -20 degrees Celsius, a man who could not move would be dead within hours. The accounts from the campaign describe being able to hear the wounded calling from positions that could not be reached, calling through the night until the cold took them, and they stopped. Dogs, feral dogs that had followed the armies into the mountains, fed on the dead and sometimes on the living who could not drive them away. These things are in the written record, in the diaries and the after-action reports and the memoirs of officers who were there and who needed to describe what they had seen, because the act of writing it down was the only way to make it real enough to survive. The total Austro-Hungarian casualties in the 3 Carpathian relief offensives has been estimated at 670,000 men. The Russian casualties on the other side of the same fighting were of comparable scale. The combined death toll of both sides in the Carpathian Mountains in those 3 months exceeded, by most serious historical estimates, the combined casualties of the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. It happened in a campaign that has no equivalent in Western memory, that has no Wilfred Owen, no Paul Nash, no cultural monument that would make it accessible to people who did not live through it. The soldiers died in the snow in the Carpathian Mountains and the world did not remember them. Przemysl was not relieved. Now let me take you back inside the fortress, because the story of what happened inside the walls through the winter is not just a story of starvation and suffering. It is also a story of what human beings do when they are trapped together for long enough, which is not always what you would expect. The theatre was open. This detail surprises people when they encounter it, but it is documented. The garrison command understood that morale was a military resource as real as ammunition and food, and they used every mechanism available to maintain it. The Olympia Cinema was showing films, the theatres were staging comedy and lighter drama. The playbill deliberately skewed toward entertainment that required no emotional investment in anything outside the fortress walls. Schools were reopened in January 1915 because the 30,000 civilians still inside the fortress included children, and children need school not only for their own development but because the presence of something as normal as school suggests that normalcy might be recoverable. Romances developed, some were genuine, some were the specific desperation of people who have been confined together long enough that proximity substitutes for connection. A woman named Ella and another named Hella acquired almost legendary status inside the fortress because they were beautiful and vivacious and well-dressed and had pleasant voices, and these qualities, which would have been unremarkable in any Galician city before the war, became extraordinary inside Przemysl. They were associated with the fortress pilots, the men who flew the supply aircraft and the reconnaissance missions, and the occasional desperate sortie to deliver mail to Vienna. They were called the Flyer Princesses. Their actual names and subsequent fates are not in the documentary record that has reached me, but their existence is, and I think their existence says something specific about what the fortress was doing to the people inside it, making ordinary things extraordinary, and extraordinary things invisible. The aircraft that brought supplies in and occasionally took correspondence out, which is how Geza Gioni's poetry collection reached Budapest, were Taube monoplanes, the standard Austro-Hungarian reconnaissance aircraft of 1914. The Taube was not designed for cargo. What it could carry was limited by its payload and the range required to reach the fortress from the nearest Austrian airfield. What it actually carried, according to the records that survive, included mail, small quantities of medicines, telegraph wire for communications, some currency, and on occasion, luxury items for senior officers, coffee, tobacco, specific foods, whose presence in the supply manifest alongside the medicines, says something about the relationship between rank and resource allocation that Thoman was also documenting in his hospital diary. The pigeon post was real. The New York Times headline of November 29, 1914, "Pigeon post from Przemysl, we are doing very well, says message to Vienna," was based on a genuine pigeon message that had actually been sent. What the message did not convey, because it was a propaganda document disguised as military communication, was the specific condition of the garrison that was allegedly doing very well. The pigeons flew between the fortress and Vienna, carrying small scrolls of paper with messages that were censored before they were released to the press. The messages that the Austrian public received told them that Przemysl was strong and confident and holding. The diary of Josef Thoman, written in the same weeks, told a different story. The ethnic violence inside the fortress, and outside it, is something the general histories of the siege tend to handle carefully, because it introduces a dimension of the conflict that sits uncomfortably alongside the story of heroic defence. But it is in the record and it cannot be ignored. On September 15, 1914, before the formal encirclement had even closed, a column of 46 Ruthenian prisoners was being marched through the streets of Przemysl under Austrian military guard. The Ruthenians were Ukrainian Greek Catholics, considered by the Austrian military establishment to be a Russophile community whose loyalties were suspect in a war against Russia. A mob, soldiers and civilians, attacked the column. What followed lasted approximately 30 minutes. The mob used sabres, which some of the soldiers were carrying, and fence posts, which were available from the adjacent infrastructure. The 46 prisoners were killed in the street, in the city, by the people who were supposedly defending it, before the siege had properly started. This incident is documented. It is not an allegation. The officers present either could not or chose not to stop it. The 46 men who were killed had committed no crime, had displayed no disloyalty, were prisoners in the custody of the Austrian army who had a legal obligation to protect them. They were killed because they were Ruthenian, because they were Ukrainian and Greek Catholic in a moment of war with Russia, and because the mob had decided that this was sufficient. The broader pattern of Ruthenian persecution during the siege is documented by Alexander Watson and others. Approximately 3,000 Ruthenians from Przemysl and the surrounding region were sent to Thalahov, a concentration camp in Styria established by the Austrian military for those it considered potentially Russophile. Approximately half did not come back, and they died of disease and exposure in a facility not designed for the numbers being sent to it. This happened while the fortress they lived near was being celebrated in Vienna and Budapest as a symbol of Austro-Hungarian heroism. Inside the fortress through February 1915, the ration situation had deteriorated to the point where the military doctors were beginning to make clinical notes about the specific physiological effects of prolonged caloric restriction on soldiers who were also required to perform military duties. The notes described the hollowing of the face, the yellowing of the skin, the specific weakness that comes from muscle loss when the body begins to consume itself. Men were dropping in the trenches not from enemy fire but from exhaustion and malnutrition. The hospitalization rate reached 1 in 8 of the garrison by March 1st, 1 in 5 by the time of the surrender. The specific detail about rats and mice is something that strikes me every time I revisit these accounts. Rats and mice are among the most resilient and adaptable creatures in any urban environment. They were present in the fortress in large numbers at the start of the siege, not just present but conspicuous, the kind of infestation that soldiers complain about in their letters home. By February 1915, the rats and mice were gone from the streets. They had been eaten. The men inside the fortress had eaten every rat and mouse that could be caught, which tells you something more precisely than any caloric analysis about the state of the food supply by mid-February. The horses, all 21,000 of them, had been the garrison's food reserve of last resort. By the time of the surrender, 13,000 of them had been slaughtered and eaten. The remaining 8,000 were still alive, barely, because Kuzmanek had calculated that keeping them alive gave him options: the possibility of a mounted breakout, the possibility of using them in some military capacity that slaughtering them would eliminate, the specific calculus of what to kill and what to keep alive, and when, runs through the entire second half of the siege as a practical military question overlaid on a humanitarian catastrophe. The December sortie, before the final March breakout, is a specific action that tends to get lost in the larger narrative of the siege. In mid-December 1914, the garrison conducted an active sortie against the Russian besieging lines, not a full-scale breakout attempt, but a significant operation designed to disrupt Russian logistics, destroy railway infrastructure behind the siege lines, and demonstrate to the garrison's own men that offensive action was still possible. The sortie achieved localized gains, disrupted some Russian positions, and then was driven back. It did not alter the encirclement. What it did was cost the garrison men and ammunition and horses that could not be replaced from any source, and produce for the garrison command a specific and practical understanding of how weak the garrison actually was when it was required to move against prepared Russian positions. The December experience shaped Kuzmanek's planning for the final March breakout in ways that make the decision to attempt it in March even more difficult to justify, because the December operation had already demonstrated what the men were capable of. Now, the specific morning of March 22nd, 1915, because it deserves its own account rather than being summarised in numbers. The breakout had failed on March 19th. The documents had been burned, the artillery destroyed, the outer forts were gone. By the morning of March 22nd, the garrison of Przemysl had effectively stopped being a military force in any functional sense. The men were walking skeletons carrying weapons. The officers had largely exhausted whatever capacity for optimism they had maintained through the winter. The specific scene that contemporaneous accounts describe in the hours before the surrender is one of organised chaos. Men moving through the streets of the city in no particular military formation, some still carrying weapons, some not, some eating pieces of the horses that were lying dead in the streets because the slaughter had stopped and the bodies had not yet been cleared. The World War I document archive account, written by a correspondent who was near the fortress at the time, describes what the surrender looked like from the Russian side. Austrian soldiers were seen fighting each other while the Russians looked on. The chaos of the final hours had produced specific individual breakdowns, men turning on each other in the frustration and despair of a situation that had run out of any remaining forms of order. Austrians were seen cutting pieces out of slaughtered horses that lay in heaps, and showing an entire indifference to their capture. The indifference to capture is the specific detail that I find most telling. These were men for whom the category of prisoner of war had become preferable to whatever was happening inside the fortress, who had lost the motivation to resist not because they lacked courage but because they had nothing left that the word resistance could apply to. A small group of staff officers appeared with a white flag. The surrender was announced, and then 117,000 men began the process of becoming Russian prisoners. Among them was Kuzmanek himself, General Hermann Kuzmanek von Bergneustatten, who had received the message that he was on his own on his 60th birthday in September 1914, who had presided over 133 days of siege, who had ordered 3 sorties and watched 2 of them fail and 1 of them be smashed in 5 hours, who had maintained communications with Vienna by pigeon and aircraft, while his men ate bark bread and horseflesh, was now the highest-ranking general of the German bloc to be captured by the Russian forces in the entire war. He was taken into Russian captivity and treated with the respect appropriate to his rank. He spent the war as a prisoner. He was released after the armistice. He lived until 1934, dying in Vienna at the age of 80. His role in the siege has been the subject of debate, whether he did the best possible with an impossible situation, or whether he was complicit in deceiving his own men about the possibility of relief, without producing a clean verdict in either direction. The evidence supports the conclusion that he was a competent fortress commander, placed in a situation that no competent fortress commander could have resolved differently, and that the decisions that made the situation hopeless were made not by him, but by Conrad, who sent the armies that died in the Carpathians and never arrived. What the fall of Przemysl meant for Austria-Hungary cannot be overstated, though it is almost always understated in general histories of the war, that treat it as a footnote to the Galician campaign rather than as a decisive event in its own right. The Austro-Hungarian army lost in the garrison of Przemysl and in the relief offensives that failed to reach it, the equivalent of multiple full-strength armies. The Empire lost the professional officer corps that had been trained before the war and had not been replaced by the reserves and wartime promotions that filled the gaps. It lost the institutional knowledge and the command experience that those officers had embodied. And it lost, in the specific weeks and months that followed the surrender, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front that it had briefly appeared to be recovering. Italy entered the war on May 23, 1915, 2 months after the surrender of Przemysl. The timing is not coincidental. The Italian government had been watching the Austro-Hungarian military situation and measuring Austrian strength against the territorial promises that the Allies were offering in exchange for Italian participation. When Przemysl fell, when 117,000 men walked out of the gate and into Russian captivity, the Italian calculation shifted. An Austria-Hungary that could not hold its own fortress, that had spent 670,000 men in failed relief offensives and lost them, was not an Austria-Hungary that could credibly threaten Italy on a third front if Italy chose to enter the war. The Treaty of London, signed in April 1915, and offering Italy Trentino, Trieste, Istria, and parts of Dalmatia, became a proposition Italy could accept with confidence. The fall of Przemysl contributed directly to Italy's decision to open the Isonzo front, to the 12 battles on the same river, to the 531,000 Italian soldiers who died in a war their country entered partly because Przemysl had demonstrated that Austria-Hungary was weaker than it had appeared. Now, what happened after the surrender? Because the story of Przemysl does not end on March 22nd. When the Russian army entered the city, Tsar Nicholas II announced, "There is no Galicia. There is rather a Great Russia to the Carpathians." He was announcing an intention. His army had already begun implementing it. The Polish elite who had run the city were arrested. The Greek Catholic bishop, who ministered to the Ruthenian Ukrainian community, was harassed so systematically that he suffered a stress-induced stroke and died. Helena Jablonska, who had recorded the whole winter in her diary, recorded what she saw when the Cossacks arrived. They waited until the Jews set off to the synagogue for their prayers before setting upon them with whips. They were deaf to any plea for mercy, regardless of age. This was day one. By May 1915, all 17,000 Jews in the city had been loaded onto army wagons and expelled eastward. Across wider occupied Galicia, approximately 100,000 Jews were forced from their homes. Alexander Watson has described this as population engineering that anticipated in its logic and its methods the ethnic cleansing that would be carried out on the same ground a generation later by the Nazis and the Soviets. Watson is careful to note this was not yet genocide. But in Przemysl in 1915, the machinery of it, the identification of a group, the decision that they did not belong in a territory, the physical expulsion by force, was present and operating. The Russians held Przemysl for 73 days. On June 3, 1915, the Gorlichstano offensive, the German-Austrian operation that produced the Great Retreat, reached Przemysl. The city was recaptured by Austrian and German forces under General von Knoissl without significant resistance. The fortifications were largely destroyed. Kuzmanek had done thorough work in the final days before the surrender. The military significance of the position was gone. What remained was a ruined city whose population had been expelled, imprisoned or killed in the months since the Russian occupation began, standing in a landscape that bore the specific marks of what siege warfare and its aftermath produce on the physical world. The fortress that had been celebrated in Vienna as a symbol of heroism had been German-Austrian again for 3 months, when the Tsar had visited on April 25th and proclaimed Russian dominion over Galicia. That proclamation lasted 73 days. The military possession of the city changed hands, as it would continue to change hands through the remainder of the war and into the peace settlements after it. The city of Przemysl became part of the newly independent Republic of Poland in October 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire finally collapsed. Now, I want to finish with Geza Gyoni because his ending is the ending this story deserves. After the surrender on March 22nd, Gyoni was taken prisoner and permitted to remain with his younger brother, Mihaly, who had also been captured inside the fortress. Together, they were marched through 9 months of captivity: Kiev, Moscow, Alatyr, Petropavlovsk, Omsk, and finally Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, a camp located on a plateau 7 kilometers outside the city, holding more than 13,000 German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war. The journey alone, 9 months, thousands of miles eastward into Siberia, was something that people had done in the 19th century to criminals as punishment. Gioni and his brother made it as prisoners of war in the 20th century, after spending the winter inside a besieged fortress. In Krasnoyarsk, Gioni wrote, he continued to write in the camp the way he had written inside the fortress because writing was the only thing that allowed him to process what was happening to him. He produced Letters from Golgotha, a collection of poems that was published in Hungary in 1916, the manuscript sent through the lines, and which represents, in the view of Hungarian literary scholars, his finest work. The poems of captivity are darker than the poems of the siege, more stripped of any residual hope that the situation might improve, written by a man who has understood that he is not going home. On June 8, 1917, his brother Mihaly died in the camp of disease. Gioni, who had survived the siege of Przemysl and the 9-month journey to Siberia and 2.5 years in Krasnoyarsk, had a psychotic breakdown after his brother's death. He died on June 25, 1917, his 33rd birthday. He was buried beside his brother at the Troitsky Cemetery in Krasnoyarsk. He died thousands of miles from the small Hungarian village where he had been born, in a Siberian prisoner of war camp, having spent the final 3 years of his life in a besieged fortress, and then a camp on the Siberian plateau. His anti-war poem, Just for One Single Night, written during the worst days of the Przemysl siege, is still taught in Hungarian schools. The poem about armchair patriots who loved their country from a safe distance, written inside a city that was running out of food, remains the Hungarian equivalent of Wilfred Owen's Dulce et decorum est. Nobody outside Hungary has heard of it. In Budapest, on the right bank of the Danube near the Margit Bridge, there is a monument. It shows a lion surmounting a cannon and a draping flag. On the base is one word. Most people who pass it every day do not know what the word means, cannot pronounce it, walk past it on the way to whatever they are going to next. They have no idea that the word on the monument represents the longest siege of the First World War, the largest surrender up to that point, the human cost of 670,000 dead in the mountains that tried to reach the city that the word names. 133 days, 130,000 men trapped and starving, 670,000 casualties in the relief offensives that never reached them, 13,000 horses slaughtered for food, bread made with bark and bone meal and sawdust, a poet writing in a besieged city about the men in safe places who celebrated from a distance, a breakout attempt that failed in 5 hours and cost 70% casualties in some units, a surrender on March 22nd that was the largest of the war to that point, a Russian occupation that lasted 73 days, a recapture that changed nothing because what the siege had cost could not be recaptured with a city, an empire that never recovered. The Austro-Hungarian army that lost Przemysl and the men who died in the Carpathians trying to relieve it never again functioned as an independent military force. From 1915 onward, Austria-Hungary fought its war as a subordinate partner of Germany, dependent on German divisions and German staff officers and German industrial output to maintain a front it could no longer hold on its own. The defeat at Przemysl was not the only cause of this collapse, but it was the moment it became impossible to deny. And that brings today's video to an end. Thank you so much for watching, and especially if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow and allows me to continue creating these videos, so I hope you'll join me again for the next one. Until then, thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.